So folks should see my first slide, which is the beautiful image from the program of this conference. And since I'm sharing my screen and I can't see the chat very well, I would appreciate if anything does come in the chat that I miss, that somebody just let me know, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question in that moment too. So like I said, my name is Aisha Chaudhri. I don't use any pronouns, just my name. And I wanted to first start with our first interactive activity, which is AHA slides. So you can either scan this QR code or type in the ahaslides.com/RJDB to access the poll that I'm doing. So folks can engage, folks can just do that right now. And I'm gonna pull up that image. Great, I see folks already engaging, which is exciting. I love watching this live. So now you all can see it as well. So I wanted to ask, are folks seeing the AHA slides right now, the poll?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. I think also there's still someone who's muted or not muted. Okay, great. Thank you all. I'm glad. Because when I pause, share, and reshare, it's hard. So just wanted to get an idea of what folks know about reproductive justice. So that's helpful. Looks like everybody, oh wait, we have 24 people. So I'm gonna wait just a second to let everybody vote on this. Looks like so most folks know some things. And some folks have heard of it, but nobody is an expert in this room, which is obviously totally fine. And it looks like there's no more new input. So that's helpful for me to know. And I just wanted to also go to the next question about how knowledgeable you are about domestic violence. Great, so we have some folks who are experts on it, which is wonderful. Some folks who know some things. This is just great for me to know, and also for me to make sure if I need to skip over a slide, which ones I can skip over. Okay, it looks like most of the folks know a lot about DV and not as much about reproductive justice. And someone shared in the chat as well, so feel free to share in the chat if that's also easier than participating here. Okay, I really appreciate you all doing this. So I'm just gonna go back to my PowerPoint now. It's so hard to figure out ways to engage digitally. So I've been trying, but there's not a perfect smooth way to do it. So I think we should be back to my PowerPoint presentation now. So starting with reproductive justice, just 101, a basic definition and the tenets that really describe what this framework is about. So reproductive justice is a human rights framework to address bodily autonomy with reproductive decision-making and creating the families people want to have. So the four main tenets that make this up are when folks get to decide if, when, and how many children they will have, as well as under what conditions they will give birth. The right to also decide if, when, and how they will become pregnant and whether or not they will carry to term. the right to parent the children they already have with necessary social supports in safe and sustainable communities and without fear of violence from institutions or individuals, and the right to maintain personal bodily autonomy. So even right here, we already can see some ways that domestic violence and reproductive justice intersect, right? When we're talking about maintaining personal bodily autonomy and also being able to live without fear of violence from institutions or individuals. This is very core to how RJ works. So the origin of reproductive justice actually, even though it's being talked a lot about now, started really early on in the 70s. The Combahee River Collective was founded in 1974, and it was an intersectional collective of Black, lesbian, radical feminists who stated that they were actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. This is also the first reference to the framework intersectionality. So even though the term intersectionality is not used here, the recognition that major systems of oppression are interlocking is that foundational idea. So this collective started in 1974, but we didn't get the term for reproductive justice until 1994, when a group of Black women leaders and activists coined the term in Chicago. So while they were not all from Chicago, they happened to be in Chicago during a time where they were really talking about how the, quote, feminist movement and pro-choice movement was not including a racial analysis at all, or a class analysis in the conversations related to reproductive health and rights. And so the term reproductive justice was coined in this conversation. And one of the leaders in this group was Loretta Ross, who is the founder of Sister Song. So Sister Song was formed in 1997, just a few years after the term was coined. And it is the largest national multi-ethnic reproductive justice collective. It is still our leading collective around reproductive justice today. And leads a lot of really amazing, wonderful work. They are in Atlanta, Georgia. However, they do work nationally. What's important to also recognize is the distinction between reproductive health, rights, and justice. They are three distinct systems. And so the terms should not be used interchangeably, even though sometimes this kind of happens. I see this even in my work when I come across other folks at different nonprofits or folks who work in repro health and rights, when they're using justice as a stand-in word, but not really referencing the movement or the core definition. A lot of folks are using reproductive rights and reproductive justice as the same thing. And it's not just about semantics and being particular about accuracy, but incorrect usage and usage without crediting is problematic, both because it contributes to the erasure of the Black women activists and organizers' intellectual labor of developing this work. And also, it contributes to the dilution and weakening of the framework when you misuse the terms and you equate reproductive rights with reproductive justice. So we want to make sure that we use the terms correctly, that we don't, again, like I said, weaken what it means by using words interchangeably when they shouldn't be. So we're going to go through a little description of what the differences are. So reproductive health is a service delivery model for addressing the reproductive health needs of people. The strategy on how they're going to do that is just improving and expanding services, research, and access to this healthcare service. It has limitations, just like any model would. And the limitations are that obviously there's barriers to access, right? And barriers to awareness of the healthcare that folks can get. So if you don't have health insurance, if you don't know what rights you have, if you don't know what in regards to your health insurance coverage, if you aren't able to go to a clinic or can't afford to go to a clinic, right, then you cannot benefit from a reproductive healthcare system. So it's an individual one-to-one service. And so therefore it cannot address root causes of disparities, because root causes of disparities are about patterns, right? They're not about an individual harmful act of discrimination or oppression. So we cannot address systems if we're only working individually with people. So reproductive rights is a legal and advocacy-based model that serves to protect an individual's legal right to reproductive healthcare services. So the strategy is using legal, legislative, and/or administrative advocacy at the state and federal level. There's obviously limitations with this too, because there's barriers to access and awareness, again, of what your actual legal rights are, and barriers to access. And if you don't have a lawyer, you might not be able to enforce your rights. If you are undocumented, you do not have civil rights in the United States. You have very fewer rights, right? And then also it assumes and expects a belief in the effectiveness of the current political system. For folks who are marginalized consistently by this system and harmed, it is really, really hard to trust that this is the system that will then set us free, right? Because this is a system that has caused us so much harm. And also, like I mentioned, it completely leaves out folks who are undocumented, folks who are immigrants, and folks who are incarcerated, right? Because not everybody has the same civil rights if you have those identities. When we finally get to reproductive justice, the way that we talk about it is as an organizing model, right? So organizing uses both education and advocacy to talk about an issue and make change. So the organizing model is rooted in the recognition of the histories of reproductive oppression and abuse to change these structural power inequities. The strategy is to center the most impacted folks and to be intersectional with everything that we do. The limitations, because there are limitations with reproductive justice as well, is that direct action and disruption of the status quo can be challenging, right? Because it requires people to do things that maybe put them at risk. It requires people to do things that maybe they don't have the capacity to do, right? Especially when we're still trying to take care of our own needs during this time. The different ways, though, that reproductive justice shows up in our work is that we want to support the leadership and power of most impacted groups. We want to help develop leadership and build social and political and economic power of communities most impacted so they can survive and thrive. We want to advance a concrete agenda that wins real individual, community, institutional, and societal changes. And we want to bring a network of allied social justice and human rights organizations to integrate the RJ analysis and agenda into their work. So that is a tall order, which is why the limitations around how challenging it can be, and also how challenging it can be to sustain it, right? Because the reproductive justice framework requires us to partner with other social justice movements, with other just movements in general. It recognizes that we can't do this by ourselves. So I mentioned the word intersectionality a couple of times already, but I wanted to just give an actual definition and awareness of who came up with this term. So it was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She is a Black queer civil rights advocate, attorney, philosopher, and a full-time professor at UCLA and Columbia Law School, where she specializes in race and gender issues. She's also the founder of Columbia Law School Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies and the African American Policy Forum that started the hashtag Say Her Name, and is the president of the Berlin-based Center for Intersectional Justice and is one of the founders of critical race theory as a whole. The reason I read off this piece is because her work has also been erased and her intellectual labor has also been co-opted by folks using the term incorrectly and just making an assumption that it's very simple to understand in the way that it's just intersecting oppressions. But it's a much deeper analysis that actually came out of domestic violence research. So it's not just the recognition. So we recognize that systems of oppression inherently intersect to create stronger barriers. So this recognition is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if we're looking at sexism and racism separately, when you combine them into something like misogynoir, which is anti-Blackness and misogyny together, a term coined by Moya Bailey, that the new set of barriers is actually much bigger than those two barriers individually. And so there is very little awareness of how to then address all of these intersecting oppressions together. And so folks really want to separate them out. We want to talk about racism separately. We want to talk about sexism separately, when actually we have to start talking about them together. And the way that this came out of research on domestic violence is Professor Crenshaw was looking into the ways that Black women who are experiencing domestic violence were treated by police and other social service advocates who were supposed to be helping them with domestic violence issues, in comparison to how white women were treated by the same police departments and social work organizations. And what she saw is that regardless of the fact that folks had the same gender identity and were all experiencing domestic violence, that Black women were more regularly not believed, were more regularly assumed to be the aggressor, and were not protected or connected to services as helpfully as white women were. And so this is where she coined this term of intersectionality, because she recognized that even Black women trying to get domestic violence services weren't even getting the same services that white women were getting for domestic violence, and that racism impacted the way that they experienced domestic violence and the way that they experienced leaving domestic violence. And so we cannot talk about domestic violence without also talking about racism and the other identities that we have that impact our ability to leave an abusive relationship. You know, since I've also started talking about oppression as a whole, just wanted to have a simple definition for us to work off of: the systematic targeting and marginalization of one group by another group because of identity. And there are 4 levels of oppression for every oppression that exists. So we have ideological, which is really focused on the belief systems behind the oppression. We have institutional, which really thinks about the different ways that our institutions like healthcare, education, etc., are complicit in keeping that marginalization up, that oppression alive. Interpersonal is when, it's a little bit more clear of like one-to-one interactions with people, or also group-based interactions. And then internalized oppression is when the person who is being impacted by the oppression starts believing that it's their fault. They start normalizing the narrative of what everybody has been doing to them as they're the reason, that they, because of their identities, deserve this, that they, because of their identities, made this happen to them, right? And so this is really important because this consistently happens in domestic violence, and this also is an impact of reproductive injustices as well. So we're going to pause here for a second and engage in another interactive activity. So if folks want to go ahead and scan the QR code or go back to the same link. Bring up the slides again. Okay. All right, so we're going to go to the next question, which is, we're going to think about sexism as the oppression that we're going to talk about right now. So what do you think is the ideology of sexism? Folks can just go ahead and input their answer, and it will pop up on the screen. Are folks Okay, there we go. I was like, maybe I'm not sharing the right screen. So obviously the image from The Simpsons in the background kind of gave some of it away. So we see misogyny, gender roles, rape culture, inequity based on sex, gaslighting, toxic masculinity, machismo, discrimination. And so as the word cloud activity, patriarchy is showing up biggest because that's what most folks have put in. So no consent, yep. Control over someone due to their gender, yep. Male dominant, power, subordinate, gender roles, control. Yeah. Oppression of individuals linked to gender and power over another. Yes. Yeah, unequal rights. You all are adding so many great things. Wonderful. Inferior. Yeah. So obviously there are lots of things that contribute to the belief system of sexism, right? So when we think about the next level of sexism, institutional, right? So what are some examples of institutional sexism? Again, I have a little bit of an example in the image in the background. But we also wanted to hear, what else do you think of when you hear of institutional sexism? So we're talking about education, employment, healthcare, financial industry, right? Like whether or not how loans are being given. There's many institutions that like academia even, so like higher education. Rigid gender roles. Latinx women are paid the least compared to cis men. Yep. Title IX dependent on administration. Yes. College admission. So Title IX is supposed to protect people in education from sex and gender-based discrimination. And so it's unfortunately inconsistently enforced. So we know that a lot of people don't take Title IX complaints seriously. I did a lot of organizing work around this when I was at Aisha, because Title IX also protects pregnant and parenting young people's right to finish education at their school, and the right to stay at their school without having to move to another school, and also the right to like have doctor's appointments, go to the bathroom as they need, eat when they need to. And we know that a lot of young parents do not have, a lot of young pregnant and parenting students do not have those rights, unfortunately. So folks are also sharing men quickly promoted into positions of leadership in female dominated fields. Yep. Wages for equal work distributed differently on gender. Title IX again. College admissions. Yep. Maternal expectations, pregnancy, child raising for women and femmes. Yep. Pink taxes. Yes, exactly. Parental leave, lack of childcare, school dress codes, women's ideas and accomplishments co-opted in workplace and education all the time. I also recently learned that you can't use your SNAP benefits to buy menstrual products. Currently, there is a bill that was introduced by Representative Barbara Hernandez that is working on menstrual equity so that people can use their SNAP benefits to buy menstrual products. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist right now. People have to pay completely out of pocket for that. There's also, folks named gender wage gap. Awesome, you all came up with some great ideas. All right, we're gonna go to the next level. What are some examples of interpersonal sexism? Oh, there's something in the chat. So someone shared women being paid substantially less than men for the same work, as well as the wage lessons when race is involved. Yep, so I believe it's 77 cents for Caucasian women. white women and 57 or 55% for Black women. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of conversation around even the number of folks who lost jobs this year in COVID, right? And so how the news has reported on the amount of jobs lost has been inconsistent. Some folks have acknowledged that the amount of jobs lost were mostly for Black and brown people, and then some people have also acknowledged that also within that there were mostly women's jobs that were being cut first. So that is absolutely an example of institutional sexism. So now in interpersonal sexism, as we can see from the Simpsons image in the background as well, which is mansplaining. It's a perfect example of interpersonal sexism: sexual harassment and catcalling, distribution of chores, families' expectations of daughters versus sons, distribution of emotional labor, menstruation jokes, yep, the mental load, yes, gaslighting, constant. Gaslighting is constant, and I do think it goes through every level of oppression. Degrading commentary relating to stereotypes of women, yep. Endometriosis and pain, medical gaslighting, absolutely. Even with, I have fibromyalgia, and so fibromyalgia is not taken fully seriously in the medical industrial complex as a real issue. The treatment for it is the antidepressant, which, to me, it's like, I need you to come up with something better than to make this assumption that I'm making this up, because that's how it's really treated. So again, because fibromyalgia affects people with uteruses and vulvas much more than people with penises. So it's really important to recognize even how it shows up in the way that our doctors talk to us about what we're going through. Women forced to leave the workforce to care for children and partners works, unequal emotional burden in families. Sexualization all the time at any age, doing anything. Yep, there's a hypersexualization for sure of women and femmes. And then a desexualization when you get to a certain age. So if you add the intersection of age into this conversation, the sexualization turns into something else. Men speaking over you or repeating your ideas. Yep, all the time. White women also do that to women of color. Naming someone as hysterical. Yeah, absolutely. Hysteria comes from the idea that this medical framework that assumes that people's uterus and reproductive organs, people who have uteruses, their reproductive organs cause them to have mental health issues. So there's also that intersection of mental health on top of sexism there. And that's where hysterectomy, right, that's the word of like removing your uterus, a hysterectomy. So naming like hysteria was what that medical condition was called. And then pressure to marry and have kids. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk more about what that means. Thank you all for engaging in that one. We get to our last level of oppression, right? This is already feeling so heavy. We just talked about sexism in so many different ways, and now we're at the last level of internalized sexism. So the beliefs that we start having about ourselves, the gaslighting we end up doing to ourselves sometimes because we've internalized those beliefs, right? So folks can share what examples of internalized sexism show up, and yep, even you thinking in your mind, second guessing that maybe you should get married and have kids, or you waited too long. Shame and guilt, absolutely. So, there is a difference between shame. Shame is when you believe that you are a bad person. And guilt is where you are aware, where you believe that what you did is bad, right? And so shame is really telling you that you're a horrible person. And guilt, you can work through guilt and get to the other side of that by remedying it. But shame is really that internalized negative inner voice. Women and femmes asking, quote, what she was wearing. Absolutely. So when we perpetuate patriarchy against ourselves, imposter syndrome, yep, saying sorry all the time, not feeling your own worth. Yeah, I see imposter syndrome multiple times. Blaming self for sexual harassment and assault. Absolutely, absolutely. Blaming yourself for domestic violence for what you're experiencing too. Someone shared in the chat that they saw an excellent documentary on Amazon Prime called Equal Means Equal, expressing how moms are seen as a problem or a burden because of motherhood, when fathers are more likely to be given supervisory positions or are highlighted because of being fathers. Absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. Not asking for a raise or a livable wage. Yep, thinking that you haven't done enough to ask for those things, or that you haven't earned enough, right? So you internalize that negative belief. Feeling guilty for getting emotional, especially in professional settings, when we all have the right to be emotional. We can't control our emotions, they exist. Thinking certain jobs or chores are for men and that you cannot excel at them. Yep. Couching suggestions and contributions as questions. Yeah, because we might be scared of the impact or the backlash from that. Internalize Western beauty standards. Yes, somebody shared that from the chat. Thank you. Believing that women talk more or are more maternal, compassionate, or emotional. And absolutely carrying the emotional load in relationships. So I think there was something else in the chat too. Oh yeah, so somebody, thank you, Katie, for putting in the chat, and for someone else for putting it into the slides. Yay. I really like doing this, so I get to like hear from you all in a different way than just me talking this whole time. So we're gonna pause here with the AHA slides, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. So I saw there was one more question in the chat. I'm just gonna go to that. Saying women cannot do something or incapable as women, or that females cannot do something because of women. Yeah, absolutely. So that's where also hysteria was talking about. Just like people really thought that you didn't have the capacity to do something because your uterus was taking up all the energy. Literally, that's what they believed. So when we just walked through all the different levels of oppression, all the different ways that sexism permeates our world, right? There's a clear recognition that it's about power, right? And power is something that we talk about in domestic violence work, but it's also something we talk about in reproductive justice work. So a very simple definition that I like to use for power is the ability to influence your circumstances. This is a neutral definition. It does not assume power is bad or good. It's literally just about our own ability to influence our circumstances. And so privileges are unearned special rights and advantages or immunities granted solely to someone because of their identity. So privileges give people more power, even if they didn't earn it, they don't have any right to it, but they have the right identity. Right, and so that has given them power. So when we think about that, when we think about that in relation to reproductive oppression, which is something that reproductive justice is really working towards. This definition actually comes from two RJ organizations, Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, which is called Forward Together now. They are in Oakland, California, and Sister Song. So they came together and came up with this definition. So it's the controlling and exploiting of women, girls, and individuals through our bodies, sexuality, labor, and reproduction by families, communities, and society. So this is minimally impacted by sexism, which includes heterosexism and cissexism. So heterosexism is the assumption that everybody is or should be heterosexual. And cissexism is the assumption that everybody is or should be cisgender. And so those two things, those two oppressions are actually under the umbrella of sexism. But I know sometimes when people talk about sexism, they do not include that conversation in there. However, they are included. So reproductive oppression is minimally impacted by those levels of sexism, by racism, by anti-Blackness, capitalism, and ableism. Minimally. There are many other things that also contribute to reproductive oppression. So it requires us to be intersectional. And now we get to our definition of domestic violence, which, because folks are very familiar with DV in the room today, you probably have already seen this before. This comes directly from our law, the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, which defines domestic violence as a pattern of intentional physical and psychological abuse, threats, intimidation, isolation, or economic coercion used by one person to exert power and control over another person in the context of a dating, family, or household relationship. So not every state includes this extensive definition, because the household relationship part is something that's not included in other states, meaning, recognizing that roommates can also contribute to domestic violence. It's not, you don't have to have a romantic or sexual relationship with someone for them to mess up your home space, right? Especially in big cities where it's really hard to live by yourself. We are in shared spaces a lot, right? And so there's an acknowledgement that you could be living with people who are doing similar things to you, but you're not in a romantic or sexual relationship with them. The 5 different types of domestic violence that are also covered in this law include physical abuse, which a lot of folks are familiar with, and sexual abuse falls under physical abuse. Harassment is the other form of domestic violence that the law covers. Interference with personal liberty, right? The right to be able to make your own decisions. That is very similar to personal bodily autonomy, right? Being able to decide what happens to your body and what you do with your body. Intimidation of a dependent, right? So if somebody is a dependent, meaning that they have a disability, are a minor, or are elderly, or need specific care, that using them specifically to manipulate and harm them is also a form of domestic violence. And so is willful deprivation, which is withholding certain things that somebody needs to be healthy and sustain, like living in a sustainable life. So someone shared that also the roommate inclusion was to allow someone to file against their same-sex partner without being forced to out themselves. I appreciate that. Thank you for adding that. So the definition of domestic violence a lot of times makes people think that DV happens in like a specific point in somebody's life when they are, right, like adults usually. A lot of times it's assumed that you're an adult, and that it doesn't happen, and it happens in a like dating or a marriage, but it doesn't really happen much else beyond that. And so we know that that's not true. The lifetime spiral of gender-based violence, we're going to show the image in a second, was developed in the early 2000s by the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. It describes patterns of gender-based violence across the lifespan from before birth through infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and as elders. Some of these are confined to one stage in the life cycle, and some continue into subsequent stages. And there's a presence of different abusers located over the life course as well, which is important to know, because a lot of times when people are providing DV services, they're just thinking about the one person who is causing harm in this person's life and not the full life of harm that maybe this person has gone through. And so this is the spiral. This is the image that was created. And as you can see, there's a lot in here. I'm not going to read all of these things out. This also can be really triggering, but I just wanted folks to see how we start with infancy, right? And we think about ways that gender-based violence can come through somebody's life across their lifespan, right? And so this was really acknowledging, again, intersectionality in how sexism comes into people's lives in different ways based upon their age, based upon what other identities they have, right? If they are a widow, if they have siblings or not, if they are a minor, right? And do not have access to certain things. So it's unfortunately really, really, really big. And there's a lot of different ways that people can be harmed across their lifespan related to gender-based violence, and domestic violence is a huge part of it. And so all of these things can be counted as types of domestic violence. And all of these things are obviously gender-based violence and sexism. So these can be exacerbated, right? If you have another identity that is marginalized, if you have a disability, if you are a person of color or are Black, if you are queer, if you're trans, right? It becomes even harder and harder and harder for you to be protected and get care, because all of those identities are unfortunately oppressed in our world. So now we've kind of talked about the breadth of things. I want to talk a little bit about the specific ways that reproductive oppression can show up in our lives. So the first way to think about is reproductive coercion. So this is when access, information, and behavior concerning reproductive health is used to maintain power and control. So this can include any attempt to influence or control someone's desire, access, or ability to engage in reproductive decision making. And other examples, examples include abstinence-only sex ed, right? Because it's telling people that they should not be having sex at all, but once they get married, they need to be having sex and having children immediately. And also, there is sabotage of contraception, can be an example of reproductive coercion, pregnancy pressure, whether by a partner or by our families, or even by a healthcare provider, right? I had my tubes tied a few years ago, but I asked for it 10 years ago. And when I went and asked for it, I had multiple doctors who told me I couldn't or I shouldn't. And they told me I needed to wait for the right man to come into my life, not even knowing anything about my sexual orientation or my desire. They were putting all of this, they were basically providing care to this future person who didn't exist and who was not in the exam room except me, right? So this is an example of how even providers can engage in pregnancy pressure and how our society engages in pregnancy pressure. So a specific example of reproductive coercion is also pregnancy coercion, right? So any attempt to influence or control someone's desire, access, or ability to get pregnant or not get pregnant as they wish. And so because sexual assault is a part of domestic violence, unfortunately, pregnancy coercion is as well, right? So this also looks like shaming people for not getting pregnant, or saying that if you love me, you would get pregnant with our kid. So really like putting a lot of shame and baggage on someone's decision about their pregnancy and making it about the whole relationship or making it about their fidelity or love of this person instead of about what you want. And so contraceptive coercion, if we follow the same thread, right, is specifically focused on people's desire, accessibility to use or not use contraception as they wish. And so we see this both in abusive relationships, but we also see this in families that don't want certain family members to use contraception because they make an assumption that it's going to encourage certain behavior that they are not okay with, right? So it's a very sex shaming ideology behind why somebody would want to prevent somebody from using contraception. There's also the assumption, right, that people who have contraception around them or access to it are people who are having sex all the time or are engaged in sex work, right? And so there's sex work stigma as well. That's part of contraceptive coercion and awareness. We've seen people throw away people's condoms or refuse to use condoms as well. So stealthing, which is the removing of a condom in the middle of a sexual act without consent, is a form of contraceptive coercion and also pregnancy coercion, right? If pregnancy is the outcome of that. So we're starting to see where some of the intersections exist for reproductive coercion and DV. I see a question in the chat. Medical ageism also plays a role for people with uteruses who are over 35 looking to carry pregnancy. Absolutely. There's a lot of discouraging of people who are over 35. There's a lot of shame that they attach to it, right? And then there's a lot of like fear mongering, right? That happens, and wanting to really make somebody feel like they're making a bad decision, and shaming them for that decision, right? And saying that you are being irresponsible, right? Irresponsible is such a subjective word, and so for both providers and other people to be saying that, is completely out of order. And also it contributes to that internalized sexism, right? Where you start thinking like, maybe I am too old, maybe I shouldn't have done this, right? And you start thinking that you've made a bad decision. So, bringing these two definitions together, right? Reproductive coercion here, on the left, when access, information, and behavior concerning reproductive health is used to maintain power and control. And then our definition of DV here on the right, a pattern of intentional physical and psychological abuse, threats, intimidation, isolation, or economic coercion used by one person to exert power and control over another person, right? We're seeing how intermeshed they are right now. It's all about power and control. And it's all about folks who want to have power and control over other folks because of their identity. And this a lot of times impacts people who can get pregnant because we have the least amount of rights in society when it comes to our reproduction. So continuing to think about the intersections of reproductive coercion and DV, like I mentioned, our reproductive coercion is a type of domestic violence, and that regardless of somebody's pregnancy desires, pregnancy and parenting is one of the most common reasons people stay in an abusive relationship, both because they maybe want a second parent in their child's life, because they cannot afford to be a single parent because of our shitty economic system, and the way that we pay people and not pay people, right? And also because of child custody, because of child support, because of other children involved, right? Pregnancy and parenting, because we do not do a good job of supporting parents and pregnant people in our society, means that people might stay in an abusive relationship longer because that feels easier than being out in the world by themselves in a system that does not support them, right? And also that shames them for being a single parent, which is very, very common. There's also research that shows that the frequency and severity of abuse can increase during pregnancy if domestic violence already existed. And this might be counterintuitive to what people think, that they assume that when somebody is pregnant that everybody is going to be really gentle with them, it is going to really care for them, but we know that that's not inherently true. Not everybody is that way, right? And that for some people, if abuse existed before the pregnancy is not a protective factor against abuse, and that because you might be more physically vulnerable now, the severity of the abuse can have a different impact on your body and also can impact the fetus. One key question is something reproductive healthcare providers use to start the conversation around contraception for people. They ask this question that says, do you want to become pregnant in the next year or two? And I don't really like this question this way because it makes an assumption that you have a definitive answer, right? And some people are like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to. And so if that's where you're starting from, it's kind of hard to go anywhere with it. It's an open-ended question. So what I like to use is a modified, I'm not a reproductive healthcare provider, but what I like to use in thinking about how folks feel about pregnancy, and also to maybe understand if there is coercion or oppression going on in the relationship, is to ask, how would you feel if you became pregnant in the next year or two? And asking about how somebody feels around a pregnancy can help you understand, like, if they say, I'm scared if I become pregnant, or I'm excited if I would become pregnant. Even if they're in an abusive relationship, somebody can be excited about the pregnancy. So we should not make an assumption that just because somebody is in an abusive relationship or an unhealthy relationship, they don't want to be pregnant, right? Because pregnancy can be separate. So we just want to make sure that people get what they need so they can feel excited about being pregnant or not being pregnant for themselves, and that other people and systems don't get in the way of that. So we're going to go into a timeline activity of reproductive injustices. So I'm giving, I know that you probably all have been given trigger warnings multiple times today. I'm going to give another one here. These historical facts are really difficult. So just wanted to name that. And I know that there are some emotional support folks from the network available at the conference who can provide support for people if they need it. But feel free, I won't be offended if you leave my session because of this. But the reason I include history is because reproductive justice is rooted in histories. And this is how we recognize we don't want to forget what happened, because it's not over, and that it keeps happening when people pretend like it didn't happen in the past. And that by staying rooted in our histories, we are requiring people to not only do better, but also to repair the harm that was caused, right? Because we cannot repair the harm that was caused by just telling people to move on. We have to actually address how it shows up in our systems. So in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson encourages troops to kill Indigenous women and children to decimate current and future generations of Indigenous people. In 1845, Marion Sims became the father of modern gynecology by experimenting on enslaved Black women with vulvas and uteruses without anesthesia. This was also due to a widespread belief that Black people don't experience pain like white people, which still exists today in medicine. There are many research studies that prove that that healthcare providers do not believe the pain that Black people are going through, especially during child labor and birthing, and that there's an assumption of when people are talking about pain that it's drug-seeking behavior. We've seen multiple people who have died from being denied healthcare because their symptoms were not believed by providers who say that they're not racist as well, right? In 1855, the court case Missouri versus Celia, an enslaved Black woman is declared to be property without the right to defend herself against rape from her trafficker. This case, she killed her trafficker while he was trying to rape her, and she was given the death penalty because she is property without the right, does not have the right to defend herself against rape. And in 1839, white women were given the right to hold property with permission of their husband, which meant that they also owned enslaved Black women as property as well. So it's important to recognize how racism even has impacted sexism in that time. In 1907, Indiana is the first state to pass eugenical forced sterilization law. So these laws mandated the sterilization of people deemed, quote, inferior and unfit. So what constitutes unfit has evolved over time, but has been defined by age, meaning if you are a young person, if you got pregnant, quote, too early, if that you are unfit. If you are low income, you are unfit to be a parent. If you have a disability, you are unfit to be a parent. If you don't have stable housing as identified by the state, you could be an unfit parent. Even how large your family is can make the state say that you're an unfit parent. So these laws, these sterilization laws, basically were allowing the forced sterilization of people who are in public institutions, either with disabilities or mental health issues or other health issues, and also including other institutions, residential institutions as well, right, which includes prisons and also includes child protective services. So these laws were passed in 32 states and were on the books until 1982. In the 1920s and 50s, 20,000 people were forcibly sterilized in California institutions for people with disabilities. And so that was 1/3 of the national average of, or national amount of people sterilized under these forced sterilization laws. Then in 1932, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis began to record the natural history of syphilis, quote, in hopes of justifying treatment programs for Black people. So it initially, that's what they said the Tuskegee study was for. So initially it involved 600 Black men, 399 with syphilis, 201 without, and was conducted without informed consent. And it was telling them that they were being treated for bad blood, which is a local term used to describe several different ailments, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue, even though they received no treatment and were even prevented from getting treatment after penicillin became the accepted treatment and rapid treatment centers were established. So the people in the Tuskegee study were not even allowed to go get treated from other places afterwards. So instead, what they got from this study was free medical exams, free meals, and a burial insurance. So they really expected these people to die, right? And originally the project was supposed to only last 6 months, and the study went on for 40 years because it was an inhumane study that did not follow any ethical guidelines because racism is baked into healthcare and medicine. And so to this day, the Tuskegee study has an impact on the Black community and an impact on Black fertility and families. In 1943, over 110,000 Japanese Americans were put into internment camps under Executive Order 9066, and people with uteruses in these camps were sterilized without their consent. In 1956, clinical trials of oral contraception on people with uteruses in Puerto Rico living in low-income housing without informed consent. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. We are not in a post-colonial world. We are in a colonial world, right? And so the United States and other colonial leaders like to do experiments of high-risk medicines on low-income Black and Brown communities. So it's important to know where our pill, the oral contraceptive pill, came from. It came from harming the bodies of Puerto Rican people. And in 1968, a campaign led by private agencies and the government sterilized 1/3 of Puerto Rican people with uteruses between ages of 15 and 44, again, without informed consent or translation. So people did not know what was happening, and they thought it was reversible. Some people who did know that it was related to contraception didn't know it was a permanent procedure. So now we move into the 1970s, where 25% of the remaining population of Indigenous people with uteruses living on reservations were forcibly sterilized. 25,000 were sterilized in 1975 alone. In 1974, we have 150,000 people with low incomes, disproportionately Black people, who were forcibly sterilized annually by federally funded programs. So these federally funded programs are public health programs. Public health used to be called population control. 1980s, the Depo-Provera shot, which was not yet FDA approved, is given to Indigenous people with disabilities to stop their periods. So not because they wanted it, but because the Indian health system said it would be easier for their caregivers to deal with their menstruation if they could just stop it completely. We see in 1992 that Norplant, which is the now it's called the Nexplanon, but it's an implant in your arm. That contraception, those programs target young Black people with uteruses who had low incomes. In 1997 to 2013, 1,400 people are incarcerated in 1,400 people incarcerated in California's women's prisons are forcibly sterilized. And the justification given by the doctor was that he was saving the state money from unwanted pregnancy and also from having these children, these babies, be on public aid. In 2009, a 21-year-old mother in West Virginia is sterilized as part of her probation for cannabis possession. So we see the intersection of substance use here as well. In 2014, a person in Virginia quote, traded a vasectomy for a lighter sentence. So trading your fertility for a lighter prison sentence is ridiculous, right? It's not a fair trade because of the power dynamic. If you didn't want that to begin with, right, it's kind of hard to make it feel like that was a consensual decision. And in 2017, Judge Sam Bedingfield in Tennessee offers inmates 30 days credit towards their jail time if they volunteer for a vasectomy or a contraceptive implant. Yeah, it's not really volunteering, right? If you are getting some, if you are in prison, incarcerated. And then in 2018 to 2020, more than 40 people in ICE detention at Irwin County in Georgia were forcibly sterilized. We just learned about it in 2020. However, there were reports that alerted the facilities in 2018 that this was happening, but nobody had broke the news until we got that legal petition that was filed with the Georgia federal court from the whistleblower. So petitioners on this legal petition were victims of non-consensual, medically unindicated and/or invasive gynecological procedures, including unnecessary surgical procedures under general anesthesia performed by the specific gynecologist. And in many instances, the medically unindicated gynecological procedures performed amounted to sexual assault even, right? Because people were being put under anesthesia and their bodies were being messed with. So this, all of, you know, this is till today. So this assumption that some folks have of like, these injustices are historical only, right? These have continued. They just keep morphing into different things. And even though that we have laws that are supposed to protect people and supposed to get informed consent, we know that if English is not your primary language, you're probably not going to get full informed consent because they're not going to provide you an interpreter, even though you have the right for one. Right? And so this is why history is super important, because it keeps happening and we haven't fixed it. The government hasn't fixed it. It hasn't even acknowledged that it's done anything wrong. So I wanted to pause here, since I've been speaking a lot, and go back to the AHA slides to have a little moment around our timeline. I'm going to go to the next question, which I just wanted to hear a little bit about maybe what surprised you about the timeline, you know, or if there were things that you didn't know about it, but just want to hear about what about that timeline was surprising or not surprising. So we have a couple of answers here. The forced sterilization of the incarcerated 21-year-old. Yep. For cannabis possession. How prevalent it still is in the present day. Yep. We keep on being told like that doesn't happen anymore. Even in my work, when I'm talking to doctors, they tell me this doesn't happen anymore. We don't have to worry about it. And it's ridiculous because it does happen. Nothing is surprising, but a stark reminder about the history of medical racism. Yeah. The sterilization of folks in the prison system. The amount of forced sterilization for incarcerated people. Incarceration, right? The 13th Amendment is interesting. It's the only way that slavery is still legally allowed, right? So people who are incarcerated are also engaging in labor that they get like 5 cents for. They're the ones that are fighting the fires in California. They make a lot of supplies that are sold. There's actually a whole industry of products created in prison that you can buy. And what I recently learned is that Medicaid's eyeglasses program, for people who have Medicaid in Illinois and get eyeglasses through them, they are made in a prison called Dixon Correctional Institute. So our Medicaid system even relies on prison labor to make things for people. right? People who are receiving Medicaid for their health insurance. Other folks shared consistent tactic of omitting informed consent and standard ethics, right? Yeah, the law is now you have to have this form, right, that prevents this abuse from happening. But if I rush you through the form, if I don't give you an interpreter, if I don't tell you what is on the form, if you don't understand what's on the form, then what's the whole point of signing the form? And when I went and got to get my tubes tied, I had to sign this form related to sterilization that was supposed to be about making sure that I wasn't coerced into it. However, I'm the one that was asking for it. And they still made me like sign this form and wait before I could have my procedure. Even though, it was what I wanted. And so these forms don't even actually accomplish the goal that they're supposed to accomplish, which is preventing the actual coercion. Somebody shared, I know the incarceration system ain't shit, but what I didn't know I was that they were using sterilization and vasectomies for shorter sentences. Yep. So technically that's illegal, and that judge in Tennessee who was caught doing it was told that he can't do it, and there was a law passed that confirmed that he couldn't do it. But he wasn't penalized. He wasn't. He didn't lose his license. He didn't lose his job, right, for doing that. They just kind of gave him a slap on the wrist. Nobody told him that was eugenics. I mean, I'm sure he knew, but like nobody like made that statement of like, you can't do that, right? So thank you all for sharing. Oh, there's one more. That disability justice overlaps reproductive justice. Absolutely. Absolutely. The first sterilization law that passed that we got was specifically normalizing the forced sterilization of people with disabilities consistently. And also when people with disabilities want to have children, they're discouraged. They're told that they can't take care of their child, that they can't be a good parent, and therefore that's why they justified sterilizing them. So I'm gonna pause here and go back to my PowerPoint, but thank you all for engaging in that with me. So I'm gonna go to what the impact of those reproductive injustices in our life means. Stratified reproduction, which is a word that talks about the impact of valuing and supporting the fertility of certain people and communities more than other people and communities. What we saw in that timeline is that people with disabilities, people with low incomes, Black and Brown people, where their fertility was devalued and their fertility was needing to be controlled by the state, and it was justified. And so what that means today, is that reproduction across our identities is not equal. We do not have equal access to reproduce in the ways that we want to. That is exactly what is happening with the Black maternal mortality crisis. Black people who are pregnant are dying at exponentially high rates compared to white people who are pregnant. In Illinois, we are above the national average even. Black people who are pregnant are 6 more times likely to die during childbirth or recently after than white people. This is not because of anything that Black person did. This is literally because of racism, because people don't believe you when you're having pain. Even Serena Williams, somebody with a lot of power, cultural power, financial power, and strength, had to advocate for herself multiple times in order for her to get the healthcare that she needed to prevent this blood clot from killing her while she was pregnant, right? So this is also how it impacts us. And this comes from eugenics. The science, quote, it's not real science, the science, but this is why people, this is why science, like people like to say it was science. This is like, science is racist as well. It's not objective. But the science of race breeding, race betterment through breeding, people with specific desirable traits, hereditary traits, and breeding out undesirable characteristics. So this supported wanting to not let people with disabilities have children. And the justification that these eugenical sterilization laws used was protecting vulnerable people from unwanted pregnancy. That doesn't sound as horrible as what forced sterilization actually is. And this statement of protecting vulnerable people from unwanted pregnancy is used today when we're talking about contraception access and what type of healthcare people get. So they like to, they had this framework, outward facing optics of eugenics is good. This is the language that they used. And our current public health system still uses this language of protecting vulnerable people from unwanted pregnancy. And they do not see the connection to eugenics, which is really scary and frustrating. Because eugenics comes from genocide. The United Nations describes genocide as these 5 different things: killing members of a specific group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This last one we are seeing with children who are detained in ICE, right? They're being lost, quote unquote, in the system, but they're actually being trafficked by our government, right? They are moving these children from their parents to other people's homes. And this is also what is done when white people go to other countries to adopt children to bring them back. The white savior complex is also contributing to, is a huge part of genocide, and is still contributing to it in the ways that adoption even works today. So it's important, it's so important for us to address eugenics, for us to address stratified reproduction, because it comes from genocide. And genocide comes from imperialism. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, and it relies on genocide, slavery, and indentured servitude to exist, and is justified by belief in hierarchy, that some people deserve things more than other people. And the different tools that imperialism uses to accomplish this are colonialism, which is the traveling, dividing and conquering of the people that you travel to, and then importing and exporting, so business and globalization. So exporting all the resources that exist there currently, and then importing things to make the people who live there have to buy from your country, right? This happens consistently where on certain islands, every produce item is exported out. And so if people on the island want to buy produce, they have to buy it, really expensive produce that has to be imported in from another country, right? So you're setting up a system that is draining somebody's resources and you're making money off of them. Settler colonialism, which is colonialism plus stealing land. So you're not just traveling, you're going and staying there now, right? And you're still doing the divide and conquer, import and export, but now you live there and you think you have the right to live there. Neocolonialism, which is colonialism through our cultural and market coercion and influence. So this is a lot of what we also see in the United States today, of using our market to engage in colonial behaviors, right? So the way of travel, right? The way that people have been traveling during COVID and spreading COVID in other countries because they feel like they can and that they should and that they deserve it because we've been stuck in our in our homes here, right? It's the normalizing of that type of movement for certain people. This all contributes, again, to reproductive oppression, which we defined earlier, right? The controlling and exploiting of women, girls, and individuals through our body, sexuality, labor, reproduction, which is both biological and social, by families, communities, institutions, and society. So where this brings us to, right, is why reproductive justice is the greatest of all time. I'm obsessed with it, obviously. I talk about it a lot, but the way that reproductive justice has even taught me about domestic violence, has even taught me about sex ed, healthcare, all of these different things, is made me recognize that if we don't have bodily autonomy and we don't have the right to create families that we want to have, that regardless of anything else, I'm not free. And that in order to achieve reproductive justice, you actually need racial justice, gender justice, birth justice, youth justice, immigrant justice, disability justice, environmental justice, economic justice, and food and water justice. Because if I don't have those things, my ability to choose if or not I want to parent, and my ability to have personal bodily autonomy and to raise my family in safe and sustainable environments without fear of violence does not exist. Flint, Michigan still does not have clean water. That absolutely affects the fertility of people who are currently pregnant and affects their baby. And it also impacts people's future fertility. People who are not getting enough nutrition, that's similar as well. Young people's rights to be pregnant and parenting are also taken away. People's ability to choose their birth plans, right? All of these things contribute to this overall goal of reproductive justice, which is our right to maintain personal bodily autonomy and create the families that we want to have, right? Which doesn't always happen from birthing. We have chosen families as well, right? So again, reproductive justice doesn't just focus on reproduction, it's focusing on our ability to make decisions about our bodies and our families. So just wanted to end, I know that we're just a few minutes before the end, with some resources that folks can check out. So my Contraceptive Justice Project has a couple of resources on our website. The report and recommendations, a school-based health center toolkit on how to increase access to contraception in our school-based health centers in Illinois, and a policy crosswalk, which is a spreadsheet that compares our laws to other states' laws related to contraception, abortion, and sex ed. I also convened the Readjust Coalition, which is advancing reproductive justice. We're made up of ICA, Illinois Caucus for Adolescent Health, NAPOF, National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and CAF, Chicago Abortion Fund. We recently just launched this coalition. We have a website. It's just readjustcoalition.org. And then we have a policy platform and agenda there, a reading list, and 2 watch list and 2 listen. So there's some movies and TV shows and podcast recommendations, including podcasts and videos made by young people from ICA doing reproductive justice work. We have a take action page too that allows you to see what petitions or things we need help on. We're trying to repeal the parental notification of abortion law in Illinois, and there's a prompt there that can take you to how to call your legislator and let them know that you want to support the repeal of this law. We also have some email updates that we provide to people if you're interested in advocating with us. And then lastly, the hashtag Advancing RJ Public Awareness and Education campaign. It's on the Readjust Coalition website. It's a campaign with 10 different fact sheets that are around our contraceptive rights and access and coverage laws in Illinois, both for Medicaid and private insurance, and for abortion. So it really helps you understand what Medicaid and private insurance does and does not cover when it comes to contraception and abortion, and also how to get that care, what it looks like during telehealth, which is happening right now, and what the federal laws, what the impact of the federal laws are on the state laws. So it really helps us walk through how you can access that care without feeling concerned. So my last slide is just me wanting to share my email address for anybody who is interested in following up, because I know I talked a lot. I really miss doing things in person because I can't see how people are reacting to my presentation, but I really appreciate you all's engagement with the slides and throughout this presentation. So I'm just gonna pause here, see if anybody has any questions. All right, so Kaylee, add a reminder to everyone, please feel free to post additional resources in the conference Padlet here. Okay, great, I will put links to all of that there. Thanks, I'm glad you liked the slide tool. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm gonna stop sharing now so I can see folks before you all leave. Well, I appreciate you all sticking to it because it was a deep and hard conversation. But I'm excited for you all to continue with the last bit of the conference, and hope you all learned a lot. Thank you. Bye.